Stories. Former US President Donald Trump blamed for an attempted coup by the committee investigating the January 6th Capitol riots. Violence flares in Papua New Guinea's East Sepik province, with buildings set on fire and up to 4 people dead. Japan reopens its borders to international tourists, but with strict COVID-19 rules. An emotional homecoming, the Nade Salingam family back in Billawilla after a 4-year immigration battle. You're watching The World. Hello, I'm Yvonne Yong. A little later, international concern grows for Somalia, with the country on the edge of a famine. We start tonight in the United States, where a House of Representatives Select Committee has accused former President Donald Trump of orchestrating last year's Capitol riot and an attempted coup. The hearing comes after almost a year of investigations into the events of January the 6th. It includes interviews with Trump's inner circle and details how his team attempted to overturn the results of the 2020 election. The committee also released new security and body cam footage, which showed the enormous pro-Trump mob as it started swarming the Capitol grounds. North America correspondent Jade McMillan reports.
The moment an angry mob breaches the first defences of the US Capitol.
This is now effectively a riot.
49 hours declaring it a riot.
New footage providing graphic insight into the storming of the building, led by members of far-right extremist groups, and the efforts of police officers who tried to hold them back.
They were bleeding, they were throwing up, they were, they had, I saw friends with blood all over their faces. I was slipping in people's blood.
With the help of a former TV executive, nearly a year of work from the Congressional Committee was weaved into a made-for-TV moment, broadcast in prime time with a single storyline: that the attack was the result of a sophisticated conspiracy with Donald Trump at the centre.
January 6th was the culmination of an attempted coup.
And we fight like hell.
The former president was accused of coordinating a 7-part plan to prevent the peaceful transfer of power, even as members of his innermost circle rejected his claims of a stolen election.
I did not agree with the idea of saying the election was stolen and putting out this stuff, which I told the president was bullshit.
It affected my perspective. I respect Attorney General Barr, so I accepted what he was saying.
After inviting his supporters to march on the Capitol, investigators argue Donald Trump ignored the pleading of his staff and family members to call off the violence.
President Trump summoned the mob, assembled the mob, and lit the flame of this attack.
I did believe, that the election was being stolen, and Trump asked us to come.
This was the first in a series of public hearings aimed at building the committee's case against Donald Trump and trying to refocus the attention of the American people on what's become an increasingly partisan issue.
Still banned from Twitter, Donald Trump took to his own social media platform to dismiss the committee's work and repeat his false claims, saying the presidential election was rigged and stolen, as his allies defended his legacy.
This is the only hour on an American news channel that will not be carrying their propaganda live. They are lying, and we are not going to help them do it.
18 months on from the attack, the committee warns the threat to US democracy hasn't eased. Jade McMillan, ABC News, Washington.
And we'll go live to Washington shortly for more on this story. In Papua New Guinea, 4 people are understood to have died in violent clashes in the town of Wewak in the country's northeast. National broadcaster NBC reported that the conflict in East Sepik province has lasted several days and started at a volleyball match where a local youth leader was killed. In retaliation, several buildings have been burnt down and 3 youths from a local village have been killed. The Defence Force have been brought in, but police are calling for more assistance to control the situation. 2 British men and a Moroccan national have been sentenced to death by a Russian-backed court in eastern Ukraine. The 3 were tried as foreign mercenaries despite being members of the Ukrainian military. They were captured in April in the city of Mariupol. One of the Britons spoke from the trenches 6 months ago.
I'm not just sitting around and going to go home at the end of it. I've been here, my family's here. My family's 15 kilometres. I can hear the shelling from my front room.
The UK government has described the court's decision as a sham judgment and says the men are being used as political pawns. The 3 have a month to appeal, with their lawyers hoping to strike a prisoner swap deal. An Australian economist who was arrested in Myanmar during last year's military coup will continue his court battle. Sean Turnell is facing up to 14 years in jail for allegedly violating the official State Secrets Act while working for deposed leader Aung San Suu Kyi. Mr Turnell has been on trial since last year, and a judge has now ruled there is sufficient evidence for the case to proceed to the next phase. His supporters have described the charges as trumped up and criticised the closed court. Australia might soften its deportation policy for New Zealanders following the first face-to-face meeting between Prime Minister Anthony Albanese and his New Zealand counterpart Jacinda Ardern. Now, she has declared she wants a reset on what has been an obvious point of friction between the 2 countries. Here's Foreign Affairs reporter Stephen Jedgetz.
Jacinda Ardern given the warmest of welcomes at Kirribilli House before Anthony Albanese had even unpacked his suitcases.
I'd arrived for the first time at Kirribilli about an hour beforehand.
Had I known that we would be there on your first night, I would have been slightly hesitant to interrupt your settling in.
Both sides want to use this visit to strengthen bonds.
It is, of course, a relationship between our 2 countries as family.
But doing that might require some compromise in Canberra.
I do see this as an opportunity for a reset because, you know, there were obviously some points of friction.
At the top of that list, Australia's policy of deporting criminals to New Zealand, where they're being blamed for an increase in violent crime.
There are some who are being deported from Australia who, for all intents and purposes, are Australian. Often zero connection to New Zealand, sometimes not even having stepped foot there.
And while deportations won't stop entirely, the new Prime Minister is signalling that his government may not take the same hardline approach as the coalition.
If people look at some of the cases that have been held, it's not surprising that the Prime Minister would make the strong representations that she had, because I would be if I was in the same position.
Also shared anxieties about China's security pact with Solomon Islands and fears Beijing is intent on building military bases in the Pacific.
We want to see an increasing elevation of the Pacific Island voice.
We're in lockstep on the Pacific.
Meanwhile, Labor has criticised opposition leader Peter Dutton after he revealed he had plans as Defence Minister to fast-track the purchase of 2 American nuclear-powered submarines, well before Australia hopes to build its new fleet under the AUKUS agreement. That's caused unease in the US and the UK and could disrupt ongoing negotiations, potentially making it harder for Labor to land a joint submarine agreement by the end of the year.
What I've said is only what's available publicly, and in addition to that, what my thoughts would be on the way forward. And if Labor is going to butcher that and they don't have the money to pay for it, they should be upfront and say it.
We're done.
Not much is being left unsaid. Stephen Jedgetz, ABC News, Canberra.
Millions of Shanghai residents will be locked down again this weekend for mass COVID testing. It comes just 10 days after a 2-month citywide lockdown was lifted and has raised concerns about the effect on businesses. There's been a rush to grocery stores and people on social media have expressed concern the lockdown could be extended. Meanwhile, authorities in Beijing are also looking to curb a possible rebound in cases, shutting entertainment venues linked to infections in 2 districts. Police in Brazil have arrested a man over the disappearance of a veteran British journalist and an Indigenous expert in the Amazon. Dom Phillips and Bruno Pereira disappeared during a reporting trip in the remote Javari Valley on Sunday. Police are testing blood found in a boat used by the suspect to see whether it's linked to the case and suggest a possible motive could relate to illegal fishing and poaching. The suspect's lawyer says the fisherman was not involved in the men's disappearance. The search is continuing and several other witnesses have been questioned. Thousands of prisoners in Thailand have walked free following changes to cannabis laws earlier this week. Families were reunited as around 4,000 people with offences relating to marijuana were released from jail and their records wiped. Thailand this week delisted the substance as a narcotic drug. It's now legal to grow marijuana and consume it, but smoking in public remains illegal. Let's return to the US, where a committee investigating the Capitol riot has held its first public hearing. For more, I'm joined by The Hill's political reporter Julia Manchester. Now, Julia, in focus has been former President Donald Trump's alleged role in the January 6th riot. What was revealed during the hearing?
There were a lot of big tidbits that were revealed during the big hearing last night. We heard the former president's daughter, Ivanka Trump, essentially say that she agreed with former Attorney General Bill Barr's statement or, I guess, belief and that the election was not rigged or stolen, that Joe Biden won it fair and square. You also heard a revelation that a number of Republican congressmen were asking President Trump for pardons after the January 6th insurrection or attack on the Capitol, after they tried somehow to overturn or played a role in trying to overturn the presidential election results. We also had some insight into what happened that day from witnesses. There was a British documentary filmmaker who was embedded with the extremist group, the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers. He talked about how he witnessed a lot of the protesters on the ground that day turn from protesters to rioters to insurrectionists. And of course, you had Capitol Police Officer Caroline Edwards talk about her experience. She fell and hit her head during the riot, and she talked about how she was very much seen as a target during the attack.
What has been the response to all that was revealed during the hearing in Washington?
Well, I think we're going to hear more today since it's just happened a few hours ago, last night's morning here in the United States. But I'm going to be interested to hear about the ratings. You know, a lot of us here in Washington who were impacted by the attacks, who follow politics, we were obviously very interested in this. And obviously a lot of media circles in the United States were interested in it, given the fact that this was a prime time special. It involved sort of the world of media and politics colliding. The committee hired the former president of ABC News in the U.S. to consult on the committee. So, you know, I'm going to be interested to see how many Americans outside of these political and media circles were watching this, because we know that this happened a year and a half ago, and I think there are questions as to how long or how outraged Americans still are and whether they want to move on.
Yet Donald Trump continues to dismiss it as a political hoax and to proclaim the last election was rigged.
He does. And I think you're seeing a lot of Republicans. That was the response to the hearing from Republicans and those defending President Trump last night, that this was a political hearing. And, you know, even though the committee has very much described itself as a fact-finding mission, they want to get to the bottom as to how January 6th happened, what went into the attack, how it can be prevented going forward. I think there are questions, from some as to, the political realm that's really surrounding it. Remember, it's a midterm election here in the United States. You have some political observers questioning whether this will impact the midterms. Liz Cheney, the daughter of former Vice President Dick Cheney, who's an outspoken critic of former President Trump, she's one of the co-chairs on the committee, and she's facing a primary challenger in August in her home state of Wyoming because she has become so outspoken of President Trump and served on this committee. We know that President Trump has backed a primary primary challenger against her. So that's inherently political in its nature. So you have this fact-finding mission that's really in a world of politics. So it's interesting to see the reactions from both sides.
And Julia, this is the first of 6 hearings expected this month. What's expected to happen next?
I think we could potentially expect more bombshell testimony. I mean, we heard very interesting tidbits from various players from Trump world: Ivanka Trump, Jared Kushner, Jason Miller, Attorney General Bill Barr. We heard all of them testifying last night. However, I think there are questions as to who could testify next: Donald Trump Jr., other Trump allies. I think we could get more of a broader picture of what happened that day, before that day, and in the aftermath of the attack.
And ultimately, what can be achieved at the end of these investigations? What's at stake here?
Well, I think there's going to be a fact-finding mission. I think this is very much trying to paint this, it's a way to present what happened, to, present the facts of what happened during the day. It'll be interesting to see how this impacts Donald Trump, if there are any consequences for him going forward. But we'll have to see. A lot of people are labeling this as a bit of a PR stunt. However, we know that there could be major consequences if, major revelations are put forth.
Julia Manchester, always good to talk. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
After more than 2 years, Japan is finally reopening to the world, with international travellers now allowed back into the country, which has maintained a hard border throughout the pandemic. The restrictions were very popular among locals, but have caused a lot of pain to Japan's tourism operators. North Asia correspondent James Oaten reports from Tokyo.
Being in Japan can be pretty great. That's not me bragging. It's a statement many Australians agree with, given it's consistently one of our top 5 international travel destinations. But it's a pleasure that's been off limits to foreign tourists since the pandemic began. But things are starting to change. The plan is for the reopening of tourism to be gradual. At first, it'll be just for those who are taking part in strictly scheduled and supervised travel tours. But tour operators hope it won't be too long before others are allowed to enter.
I'm very excited. I hope from the bottom of my heart that many foreign visitors will come to Japan and spend a nice time here. I'd be very happy if they took a ride on my rickshaw.
International tourism is big business in Japan. During the pandemic, turnover for this rickshaw company plummeted to less than a third of normal takings.
The number of rickshaw pullers at our company is about half what it was before COVID. I have many mates who left this job saying they couldn't live without income anymore.
But this is a country that takes COVID concerns very seriously. A hard border has been very popular, and it was only last month that the government advised residents they could take off their masks if outdoors and when socially distanced.
Of course, I want tourists to come, but the standards of COVID measures seem very different in foreign countries than in Japan, so we need them to cooperate and understand. Many foreigners dislike masks. We would like them to wear masks. It's a small risk, but it would be regretful if they got COVID.
Domestic tourism has boomed in recent weeks, and so far there hasn't been a spike in COVID numbers. Thanks to that, the mood here is certainly relaxing, and it won't be long before tourism hotspots like this see a lot more foot traffic.
A Tamil asylum seeker family has finally returned to its adopted central Queensland home after more than 4 years in immigration detention. There were hugs, tears and cheers when the Nada Salingam family touched down in Billawilla for the first time since 2018.
A journey years in the making. The Nardesalingams finally back in Billawila, overcome with emotion. Priya Nardez and their Australian-born daughters, Kopika and Tanika, surrounded by friends.
We waited. Yes. You're home.
Last time I saw you, you were a tiny little baby and you used to fit in my arms.
The new federal government has granted the family bridging visas, allowing them to return to central Queensland.
That is all they have ever wanted, is to just be a family.
and to just live in safety in our community. So it's a very joyous moment here today.
Thank you to all in below community, wonderful friends. I starting new life.
The celebrations will continue over the weekend at the local cultural festival, while on Sunday, Tarnika will celebrate turning 5, her first birthday outside of detention. The Nardazalingams had found work and a home in the small town. The parents had separately fled Sri Lanka over fear of persecution. But when their temporary bridging visas expired in 2018, they were taken into immigration detention, sparking a grassroots movement to bring them home. Immigration officials repeatedly assessed the family's claims for asylum, and because Nadez frequently travelled between Sri Lanka, Kuwait and Qatar until 2010 for work, he was not of concern to Sri Lankan authorities. An attempt to deport the family was halted by a last-minute court challenge, and they were detained on Christmas Island before being released into community detention in Perth last year.
Detention life is hard in the both children mentally.
Supporters are now calling for permanent protection for the family and other refugees.
Today we celebrate, but the next step is to make sure that we don't ever do this to anyone else in Australia ever again.
So happy. Thank you.
Rachel McGee, ABC News, Biloela.
The PGA Golf Tour has suspended 17 of the top-ranked golf players who were taking part in the Saudi-backed Live Golf Series. The rebel competition, headed by Australian Greg Norman, has driven a wedge in the sport, with players accused of ignoring human rights abuses in Saudi Arabia.
And here we go. The trumpets sounded out as the players teed off in a move that harks back to World Series cricket, a rebel competition taking on the status quo.
The future of golf is here.
That future is the brainchild of Australian Greg Norman. He secured a reported 2.8 billion Australian dollars from the Saudi Arabian government's investment arm, prompting criticism from human rights advocates.
Saudi Arabia, unfortunately, has a pretty poor human rights record. In March this year, they executed 81 people in a single day.
The 48 players competing in the first event in London include multiple major winners like Phil Mickelson, who are playing for a staggering $35 million in this tournament alone.
I just feel so happy for the players. I feel so happy for the fact that we've brought free agency to the game of golf.
Those players are freer now than ever. 17 of the top names, including the former US Open champion Graham McDowell, have now been suspended from the PGA Tour.
It was a tough decision. I wanted to keep the moral high ground and kind of remain a member of the tour.
Liv hit back, calling the decision vindictive and saying it deepens the divide between the tour and its members. But that hasn't stopped the questions.
And that ultimately you could be seen as a Saudi stooge and that could tarnish your legacy. Is that you comfortable with that?
I said earlier, I don't condone human rights violations.
When sports people like Lewis Hamilton or Naomi Osaka do speak out, they have shown the world how powerful that can be.
The Liv Rebels are free to play at the US Open next week. It's a tournament run separately to the PGA, but there they'll meet their non-rebel peers and matters will surely come to a head. David Mark, ABC News.
The United Nations has warned that nearly 250,000 people are on the brink of starvation in Somalia. A worsening drought and rocketing global food prices are compounding problems in the country, where more than 700,000 people have been forced to flee their homes in the past 6 months in search of food and water. Deputy Regional Director of UNICEF Eastern and Southern Africa, Rania Dagash, visited refugee camps recently. She shares with us what she saw.
I saw one of the worst climate-induced crises in recent history. I saw mass displacement, which is one of the main ways people cope in droughts. When they have no water and no food, they move. I saw mostly women, grandmothers and mothers, and young children trekking for hundreds of kilometers to get to help. Severely malnourished children who are sick, measles and cholera on the rise, and our treatment centers absolutely packed to the rafters. I also saw hope. Our response is actually working in many places where we are able to reach. And it's simply not enough, Yvonne. We are not able to reach all the children. We're only a third funded for what we need to reach all of those affected by the drought.
Well, tell us about some of these immediate needs. UNICEF is now finding the need is outpacing supply in terms of aid, as you've said.
Absolutely. What UNICEF is really good at is our ability to reach those in need, in crisis, as well as in development. And I'll tell you a little about both. In crisis, it's about water, getting water to those displaced, getting water to those affected by the drought. It's a water crisis fundamentally. It's about our ability to get therapeutic feeding to the malnourished children to help save their lives. It's about treating cholera and measles. It's about getting the education and the schools to continue running in these displaced camps so children aren't even more disrupted and vulnerable, and extending our protection to those children who are even more vulnerable when they're displaced from their homes.
And Rania, speaking to those mothers and women and children that you saw in those camps, it must have been really difficult for you.
It was, Yvonne, this time more than any previous time, and maybe because I leave a healthy young boy at home as I hold these sick babies and as I comfort the mothers and the grandmothers. I honestly haven't seen it this bad since I started working in this region, and that's 22 years ago. But the stabilization centers are absolutely full. There isn't a single empty bed in the only referral hospital we have in Mogadishu. And it's just pure desperation. Not enough food, not enough medicine, not enough space. It was very difficult. And I broke down in every stabilization center that I visited.
And as you've said, a major contributing factor is drought over many months. Also, how has the war in Ukraine impacted Somalia?
So there are many factors that affect the situation in Somalia today. Climate change would be the first and foremost, one would argue, and conflict another, access to certain locations. But what the war in Ukraine did is it did three things. It diverted visibility of the global arena. It also diverted resources, and it fundamentally hiked prices of food and fuel. And the combination of all these factors is quite catastrophic for Somalia and the effects of the drought.
At what point do you think it will be declared a famine in Somalia, and what difference might this make to the help that's being provided?
I don't think the question is when we will declare famine or if we declare famine. The question is, why do we have 1.7 million children hungry in 2022? Why? Why is it morally and ethically okay for children to be this hungry and this sick and to die because of hunger and lack of access to resources and to food and to water? So I can respond to that technically when we declare it, but the real question is we need the resources to prevent a famine from happening today.
You make a very good point there. Are you hopeful that you will be getting those resources? You've been speaking to local authorities about what's needed most. What have they said?
The local authorities are extremely committed to this. It's not the first time that they see this. And so, unfortunately, this is the third drought for Somalia in a decade. But this one is the longest we have seen in the history of the region, and it is one of the worst. We are working closely with the local authorities and with local NGOs and with the entire humanitarian chain to respond. We are good at doing this if we get the resources to respond, and we can prevent a famine from happening, even more importantly. We just need to be able to reach people closer to their areas of origin before they trek for very long. On this trek is where we lose the children. On this trek and on arrival after 100, 200 kilometers walking is when the children fall sick. And that we can prevent. I am quite hopeful. Some of our donors have been extremely generous, but it's not enough. We only have a third of what we need.
Rania Dagash, thank you so much for talking to us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you very much.
You're watching The World. The top stories we're following tonight. A US committee investigating the Capitol Hill riots has blamed former President Donald Trump for the violence. Reports of 4 people killed and buildings burnt down during days of long conflict in Papua New Guinea, and a Tamil asylum seeker family welcomed back to the Queensland town of Billawila, but their fight to stay in Australia isn't over. Coalition frontbenchers are defending a federal opposition leader, Peter Dutton, from accusations he's jeopardised Australia's nuclear submarine negotiations. The former Defence Minister took to the opinion pages of the Australian newspaper to say he had hoped Australia could buy 2 US-manufactured nuclear submarines before the end of the decade. The comments have sparked anger in military and diplomatic circles, with concerns Mr Dutton's decision to divulge sensitive discussions could hamper plans for a joint agreement on Australia's nuclear submarine fleet by the end of the year. Here's Defence correspondent Andrew Green.
That plan that was until now confidential and very much behind the scenes negotiations between Australia and the United States to secure 2 Virginia-class submarines off the production line in America and to put them into service with the Royal Australian Navy. Now, this was not known until Mr Dutton published it in his opinion piece, but he also, in attacking Labor's plans on submarines and what he believes is a possibility that Labor could walk away from AUKUS, he also disclosed some capability doubts about the existing Collins-class submarines, and namely that there are concerns within Defence that they will be detectable by the Chinese within about a decade. Now, this information is not considered to be widely known and certainly not discussed very publicly and very often. So that has annoyed some of Mr Dutton's former coalition colleagues, and as a number of military experts have publicly spoken out, and the Labor Party has also criticised these comments as being loose. They say that it may have damaged Australia's national interest. If that's the case, Peter Dutton is certainly making no apologies. He insists that what he did say was already known publicly, and this is what he had to say when appearing on morning television.
What I've said is only what's available publicly, and in addition to that, what my thoughts would be on the way forward. And if Labor is going to butcher that and they don't have the money to pay for it, they should be upfront and say it, because that's the path they're taking us down at the moment. And as I say, that is not in our national interest.
The other parties to the AUKUS arrangement are, of course, the United States and the United Kingdom. Privately, officials who are linked to this partnership and are working on Australia's plans for acquiring nuclear submarines are a little bit miffed that some of these previously confidential discussions are now very public. Of course, there are sensitivities with the fact that Australia may have been leaning towards the US option, and now that is very public, so the British are not particularly impressed that that's public, but also the idea that that we can be openly discussing the limitations of conventionally powered submarines that Australia currently operates. That has caused a bit of unease. Certainly, if they are unhappy, they're not saying it publicly, but privately there has been a bit of angst as a result of this editorial written by Peter Dutton.
Returning to Japan now, where the country is finally reopening to tourists for the first time since the beginning of the pandemic. But it's not without COVID restrictions still. Donna Weeks is a lecturer at Musashino University in Tokyo and joins us now out of Tokyo. Now, Donna, this isn't a full reopening to tourists from anywhere and everywhere, is it?
Not quite, no. There are still some restrictions and people will have to come as part of a group tour. So there's no individual tourist visas being offered at the moment. But if people come in a group and stay within the group and follow I believe it's a 16-page book of guidelines, they can spend some time in Japan, yes.
What is in that book of guidelines? What restrictions are still in place for travellers, including Australians intending to holiday in Japan? What do they have to do, be mindful of when booking tickets, and do they have to wear masks?
Yes, masks are still very much required. Just recently, the government did say to most of us, if we're outdoors and we're not near anybody and it's all quite safe, we can take our masks off. But masks are still required indoors, on public transport, anywhere that you're going to be close to people. And so they're asking that you keep your masks on. We still have hand sanitisers everywhere you go, and in some places like my workplace here, we have thermal cameras to make sure that your temperature is sitting at the right, below 36 or around about 36 degrees Celsius and so on. So those sorts of things will be required, and I do believe also that they'll be asked to have some health insurance to cover any medical emergencies and things like that.
And testing and quarantine requirements, are they strict?
It depends now on which country you come from. There's a kind of a traffic light, red, yellow, green, of different countries. Australia's in the green country at the moment. And I think people, if they've had the required vaccinations and boosters, there's not a quarantine period required. Depending again on the country that you come from, it may be 3 days, it may be 7 days. It just, there are some restrictions, but I think at the moment, if Australians come in one of those group tours and they stick to all the rules, it should be okay.
Okay, it's definitely less strict than before. I've noticed that you've noticed that Australia's flu levels have not gone unnoticed in Japan. Are there concerns around this as the country opens up to tourists?
Well, this is interesting. When I got home last night and was watching the late evening news, there was quite a lengthy broadcast actually following the coincidence of COVID and the flu in Australia as we're going into winter. Now, this happened also back in 2020. Japan was very keen to watch how countries in the Southern Hemisphere, particularly Australia and New Zealand, were going to handle COVID going into winter. But certainly last night, yes, there was a lot of attention given to the flu and how much it's increasing, what that's going to do with COVID. And I think too, with the case numbers, the case load that seems to be happening in Australia, as much as I can see anyway, there might be a little bit of concern that the case numbers are quite high in Australia at the moment, certainly.
It definitely is going around from my experience here anyway. And I guess when gauging how locals are feeling about this and the reopening, it really depends on who you talk to, doesn't it?
It certainly does, and obviously the TV programs in the last couple of days have been going to all the very popular tourist areas that have suffered, very much over the last 2 years. And of course, people there for whom tourism is their business, it's their livelihood, are very keen, and you could see them opening up all the new boxes of goods and things. They're very keen to be showing Japan off again in different ways to people as they come back and all the rest. On the other hand, a lot of some tourism operators that I've been speaking to as well have said that actually this is also an opportunity to look at more sustainable tourism, and that they want to look at ways that people can still have a very rich experience. But given our COVID experiences in the last couple of years, how can that tourism be much more sustainable? It might be keeping people in smaller groups or getting them out into the regions and doing things like that to sort of avoid the crowds that we tend to see here in Tokyo and the rest. But I think sustainability is coming through as a particular aspect that
it's interesting how the pandemic has changed the way we live and how we look at certain issues, isn't it? Can you tell us, has life pretty much returned to normal in Japan? Public transport's up and running, people are back at work, entertainment venues back to full capacity?
Pretty much. The trains are getting back to, if I have to come to work early, it's a bit crowded and I have to stand. And fortunately tonight going home, it probably won't be as crowded as it might otherwise be. People are still trying to keep their distance. Our classes here at university, though, we're still required to wear masks. I mean, I'm in my office at the moment by myself, which is why I don't have my mask on. But our classes, some are face-to-face, a lot are still online, depending on the size of the classes. So people are taking it fairly cautiously at the moment, I think.
Thanks for staying behind at work for us too, by the way. Is COVID still very much a concern in the community there? What are case numbers like at the moment?
Well, we still get our notifications at about 4:45 every day. We sit and look. Today was only about 1,600 in Tokyo. So the case numbers are coming down, and I noticed they had that, sadly 3 people had died, which I know is a big contrast with Australia. Yes, people are still concerned, but vaccination rates are up and things like that. So some students have been catching COVID and staying away, but yeah, it's still here, but we're learning to, I guess, live with it, yeah.
And just very quickly, Donna, how did these new reopening rules affect travellers wanting to leave the country? Personally for you, what will these changes mean?
Well, hopefully I'll be able to get back into Australia at some point. It's been a bit hard, obviously, for a lot of Australians overseas not being able to get back home. But I think it should be, provided the flights are available. I mean, Qantas still isn't flying, for example, so we have to wait and see whether or not we can get a flight. But certainly compared with even, say, 3 months ago, it should be getting easier for all of us, I would hope anyway. So I'd be looking forward to seeing a lot more Australians coming and visiting us here anyway. So, and also being in charge of the student study abroad program too. Our students are finally being able to go and study overseas, and students will be able to coming to study as well. So that's a really exciting thing for them.
Yeah. Oh, well, great to talk, Donna. Thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you, Yvonne. My pleasure.
A baby who had been missing for more than 40 years has been found in the United States. Holly Klaus went missing as a baby in 1980. Her parents were found murdered in a wooded area in Houston, Texas the following year. The couple were only identified through genetic testing last year. Ms. Klaus, now aged 42, has been located by Texas investigators and has met her extended biological family for the first time.
Holly was left at a church in Arizona and was taken into their care. Out of respect for Holly and her family, we won't have any further comments or details regarding that at this time. The family that raised Holly are not suspects in this case. 2 women who identified themselves as members of a nomadic religious group brought Holly to the church. They were wearing white robes and they were barefoot. They indicated the beliefs of their religion included the separation of male and female members, practicing vegetarian habits, and not using or wearing leather goods.
The remains of Europe's biggest land-based predatory dinosaur have been found in the United Kingdom. Experts say the bones found on the Isle of Wight show it was an immense creature.
It's been called a giant killer. As high as a house and as long as a bus, this Spinosaurid is a colossus from the Cretaceous era.
This is one of the significant pieces. This is half of a backbone.
Its remains are now at the island's Dinosaur Museum, where experts say it was a fearsome creature.
You wouldn't want to go near it. They have incredibly large teeth and a lot of them in a very long skull. I mean, these things have got big fishing hooks on their thumbnails, so it's not the sort of thing you would want to bump into.
The Spinosaurid is 120 million years old, twice the age of a T-Rex. The bones were found on the west side of the island, a coastline rich in dino discoveries.
Well, at the bottom here, we've got these red ancient soils.
But never one quite like this.
Well, it's a tremendous find. It's something that was totally unexpected, just some bones falling out of the cliff. We've actually, with these fragments, been able to piece together the biggest meat-eating terrestrial dinosaur in Europe. It's absolutely amazing.
Experts from the universities of Portsmouth and Southampton say they hope to discover more remains to complete the story of a creature that roamed and ruled its ancient domain.
Amazing there. Now, Japanese scientists have taken another step towards developing robots that look like humans. Researchers at the University of Tokyo have created lab-grown human-like skin for a robotic finger. The coating's made of human skin cells, is waterproof and can heal itself. To the war in Ukraine, where a volunteer soldier is using his music to help him cope with the stress of the invasion. 23-year-old Otoy is a rap artist who gets inspiration for his music direct from the front line.
For concert goers in Kiev, this is the sound of war. Rapper turned volunteered soldier Vyacheslav Otoy Drofa is one of many Ukrainian men that signed up to defend his country from Russia's invasion. As part of the civilian defense force, Otoy completed short stints on the front line, delivering ammunition to soldiers, where he wrote 4 songs against the backdrop of gunfire.
On the front line, every time you can actually feel the smell of, like bombs, dead bodies and dust, blood and other stuff. So all of this stuff is inside of these tracks. You can hear it.
Among his works is the song Find My Country, which he wrote to help raise awareness of the devastation caused by Russian attacks. He also dedicated it to the Ukrainian soldiers, including his brother, who were forced to surrender the Azovstal steel mill to Russian forces in Mariupol.
This is like the way, I don't know, like maybe just to have fun. You know, like Russian soldiers drink vodka, we are making music.
His songs have helped to put words to the horrible tragedies of the war. And it fuels a furious generation of young Ukrainians that will never forget and may never forgive Russia's aggression. Chantal Hayden, ABC News.
Art lovers are in for a treat this winter with the opening of a major Picasso exhibition at the National Gallery of Victoria in Melbourne. The Picasso Century features not only the works of the famed Spanish painter, but also dozens of others by his contemporaries. It's taken 10 years to get the priceless works of art in one place.
He was a true giant of modern art, a man of tremendous artistic and cultural influence. Now, 80 of Pablo Picasso's works are here at a special exhibition at the NGV in Melbourne, and the man who curated it is Didier Ottinger from the Pompidou Centre in Paris. Didier, good morning.
Good morning.
Tell me about Picasso to you. What does Picasso mean to you as an artist?
Oh, he's literally a sponge. And it's a strange idea because it's not exactly the idea we have of a genius, but a real genius is a sponge. And we can see that in the exhibition. He's absorbing contact with different people and taking ideas from them. He's taking account of a situation where he lived in Paris, in the south of France. And the exhibition is a demonstration that he's always reacting to the real.
How long did it take for you to go through Picasso's enormous array of works and choose the paintings and the other works to display here?
Yes, we used to say that we work for this exhibition since 10 years. We don't work every day since 10 years, but we had to fix the list of works 10 years ago because there is many masterpieces in this exhibition and they are under a big pressure from every museum in the world. So to keep them together, to be able to gather this full collection, we had to reserve them in a way a long, long time in advance.
Well, shall go and see some of his works?
Yes.
Let's go. So Didier, tell us about this painting.
Now, this is one of the paintings of the so-called blue period of Picasso. Picasso, when he just arrived in Paris in 1900, he came with friends, painters, and they were quite pleased to see the very vivid city at the time. But unfortunately, one of his friends, Casagemas, he committed suicide, and it was a break for Picasso. And from that time, he decided to paint his pain, his sufferance in the blue color, which is the color of the sentiment, which is the color of the romanticism in a way.
So Didier, Weeping Woman, a painting very familiar to lots of Australians. Tell us about it.
Yes, this painting is generally associated to Dora Maar, who was the wife with whom Picasso started to live at that time when he was painting this work. But she's more an inspiration than a model for him, because she was a very political woman, and she wake up Picasso's consciousness of the politics of the time. And it's the time when Picasso was making his major work, Guernica, a great gesture against the civil war in Spain. And this weeping woman became the allegory of this painful time.
This painting is quite notorious as well because it was actually stolen from the NGV many years ago.
I used to say it could be your Joconde, your Mona Lisa, because when a painting is stolen, it became very famous, and some of them became really masterpieces in a specific collection, yes.
So a good painting is one that's been stolen?
It could be, it could be. In many cases, this is the situation, yes.
So Didier, tell us about the Matador.
Yes, this is the time when Picasso is joining finally what we could call his spiritual family. His spiritual family, you can see, this is people coming from the 17th century, the golden age of painting, where Picasso belongs in fact. He is friendly in this type of painting with Rembrandt, with Velázquez. He is very close to the novelists and authors, poets of the Spaniard tradition of the 17th century love, and specifically, of course, you can see that, Don Quixote. There is something connected to Cervantes in the way he's showing himself.
Is this one of your favourites of Picasso?
Yes, because it's a moving image. It's just painted 3 years before he passed away. So this is a kind of testimonial representation of himself.
The AFL has backed Port Adelaide's decision to send 2 players back on field without concussion tests, minutes after a sickening on-field head clash. Port coach Ken Hinkley strongly backed the decision of his club's doctors, but some experts say the decision was concerning.
It was a match-defining moment at a crucial point of the fourth quarter. Zach Butters and Tom Jonas left bloodied and bruised after this sickening head clash. The Port players came to the bench, but returned within minutes, without completing concussion tests, which would have ruled them out of the rest of the game.
I've got a doctor who's been with our footy club 25 years. And the conversation between our doctor and our football manager during the game was, these boys have got no issue with concussion.
But the decision certainly raised some experts' eyebrows.
I certainly think we need more scrutiny at every level. We all saw what went on. By the league's own rules, that defines concussion.
If anyone's got a challenge on that and they feel more qualified than Mark Fisher, who's a 25-year AFL doctor, feel free. But I think you want to be really, really sure that you're not trying to umpire or make some calls from outside the fence when you have no knowledge.
The AFL was quick to back Port's decision, the league's chief medical officer later ticking off on the club's sideline assessment.
They're all first class and they'd never put a player at risk, no question. They make a quick assessment and that's what they do, that's what they're paid to do.
But some believe the medicos doing the concussion assessments should be paid by someone other than the clubs.
But when we get to the elite level, the codes are certainly wealthy enough to be able to afford it. Let's put that money to good use into looking after the players.
Port trailed for most of the game, but hit the front before the head clash. The Tigers hit back late to secure a hard-fought win, moving them into the top 8. Port now sits 2 wins outside the 8 and is likely to lose Trent Dumont, who was sidelined with a calf strain. Cameron Slesser, ABC News.
Perth Glory's rebuild following its disastrous A-League season has hit an immediate hurdle, with captain Brandon O'Neill walking out on the club. O'Neill rejoined the Glory ahead of last season on a 3-year deal, but told the club in February he wanted to leave. The club has released him from the remainder of his contract, but says the situation is very disappointing. O'Neill's departure follows that of Daniel Sturridge and Osama Malik, as well as the sacking of coach Richard Garcia. It's time now for a look at the national weather.
Well, the nation's southeast is getting ready for the next weather systems. Embedded cold fronts that will cross Tasmania and eastern Victoria, and combined with that very deep low, they're going to strengthen the cold southwesterly flow, and there'll be more rain in the west as well. The infeeder tropical moisture in the north is now weakening, but bands of showers and thunderstorms will cross the coast ahead of a low and fronts in the south. We have warnings for damaging winds tomorrow for southern parts of the New South Wales central tablelands and down to the Snowy Mountains and to the south coast, parts of northeast Victoria and Gippsland, and for most of Tasmania, although not along the west coast or the upper northeast, and blizzard conditions expected in the Alps. Closer in, morning frost over inland parts of southern and central Queensland with a partly cloudy day to follow. Should be sunny though in Brisbane and elsewhere in the state. Mostly sunny over New South Wales after some morning frost inland and on the ranges. A few showers still around the western slopes and ranges. In Sydney, it's going to be windy and sunny. Canberra will be partly cloudy, and there's hazardous surf expected from the Byron to Batemans coasts. In Victoria, a familiar story this week, scattered showers on and south of the ranges and in the northeast, breezy in Melbourne with a shower or two, especially in the eastern suburbs. Showers and small hail for Tasmania, more frequent in western, southern and central areas. Snow getting down to 400 metres in the south later. Windy in Hobart with 6 to 8 millimetres of rain and damaging surf on the south central coasts. The chance of a shower in Adelaide and showers for South Australia's southern agricultural area, also about the mid-north ranges and near the eastern coast of the Eyre Peninsula. Wet in the west, showers southwest of a line from Port Hedland to Newman to Giles. Chance of thunderstorms there as well. Perth will have 6 to 8 millimetres of rain with showers. Another chilly night over southern parts of the territory. Partly cloudy south of Elliot in the eastern Arnhem district, but sunny elsewhere, including Darwin.
Before we go recapping our top stories, the US committee investigating last year's attack on the Capitol holds Donald Trump responsible for the violence and attempted coup. Buildings burnt down and reports of 4 people killed during a days-long conflict in Papua New Guinea. And the central Queensland town of Billawilla welcomes a Tamil asylum seeker family home, but the family's fight to stay in Australia isn't over. And that's your world for this Friday evening. I'm Yvonne Yong. Bye for now.
I'm always behind. They always send me a reminder, of course.
Australia's energy squeeze.
The prices are just exorbitant and would put us out of business very quickly.
Why households and businesses are facing soaring power bills.
The biggest issue driving the price volatility is the lack of supply.
It's very stressful and lots of people are gonna be in very bad situation.
7:30 next week. ABC TV and ABC iView. She started from nothing.
You're black, you're a woman, you're from the bush, you've got to be real here.
What she's experienced makes her story all the more extraordinary.
But refused to let it stop her.
She's somebody that had a dream and actually followed it to its nth degree.
I think she's only just getting started.
Leah Purcell on weaving her history into her future.
The drover's wife is part of my songlines. I was that little boy in Henry Lawson's story. This is who we are, and it's mighty.
Australian Story, Monday at 8, ABC TV.
It's the number one fear that older people have, more than any other disease, more than anything else.
The race to solve dementia.
We've had too many centuries with no cure. We ought to be able to find something.
I've never seen the press coverage this drug's received.
I would not prescribe it for myself or anybody else.
And the blueprint for a better brain.
If we can give people another 5 years, that's going to make a massive difference.
Thank you for remembering, because I couldn't remember.
Four Corners, Monday, ABC TV and ABC iView.
Journey to another world as ABC Classic brings you the Classic 100 Music for the Screen. From Game of Thrones to The Crown, from Mario Brothers to Final Fantasy, from Jaws to Star Wars. Celebrate your favourite music from film, television and gaming with Australia's biggest weekend of classical music. The Classic 100 Music for the Screen. This weekend on ABC Classic and ABC Listen.
Julian Assange has been suffering terrible deprivation because he published the truth.
Julian isn't a name, he's not a symbol, he's a human being.
What are your worst fears?
Those are just collapses.
It's okay. In no sane world can this be normalized.
We're here because we have a child in the and want to get him out.
Twinkle, little star.
Ithaca, a fight to free Julian Assange. Tuesday, ABC TV and ABC iView.
After the last 2 years, we could all do with a bit of a boost. And a COVID-19 booster, it boosts more than just your immunity.
It's a boost to my bottom line.
A boost to my confidence.
A boost to my fitness.
A boost to our social life.
A boost to my happiness.
Give yourself a boost and keep up to date with your vaccinations by visiting australia.gov.au. Authorised by the Australian Government, Canberra.
Gruen is back with the tastiest ads on TV.
Yum, yum, I'm in food. Yum, yum.
That is really weird. And the team is off to a flying start.
Is Top Gun the best propaganda campaign ever?
The problem is you've got 13-year-olds exposed to this marketing about the military. There needs to be some restrictions.
This is how it works, right?
Oh, okay.
Welcome back, Russell. No!
New Gruen, Wednesday at 8 on ABC TV and ABC iView.
Experience an astounding winter wonderland.
Is there a place more beautiful, more wild than the realm of the Southern Oceans?
Join hosts Hamish McDonald and Dr. Anne Jones for an extraordinary live television event.
Looks like you're in for some trouble.
Be there as the miraculous plays out.
My heart is going so fast right now.
Southern Ocean Live, Tuesday, June 21 on ABC TV and ABC iView.
Hello, Yvonne Yong with the top stories on ABC News. Australia might soften its deportation policy for New Zealanders following the first face-to-face meeting between Prime Minister Anthony Albanese and his New Zealand counterpart. Jacinda Ardern has declared she wants a reset on what has been an obvious point of friction between the two countries. Ms Ardern is the first foreign leader to visit Australia since Mr Albanese's election win. The two leaders also discussed China's growing influence in the Pacific. A Tamil asylum seeker family has finally returned to their adopted central Queensland home after more than 4 years in immigration detention. There were hugs, tears and cheers when the Nades Sellingham family touched down in Billawilla for the first time since 2018. And the committee investigating last year's attack on the US Capitol has blamed Donald Trump for what it's described as an attempted coup. In a highly produced public hearing, the committee released never-before-seen footage and testimony from some of the former president's closest advisors, arguing the violence on January the 6th was a direct result of a desperate attempt to stay in power. Those are the latest stories. For more, visit our website abc.net.au/news. I'm Yvonne Yong. Bye for now.
Hello and welcome to The Drum. I'm Catherine Robinson. Coming up, after 4 years in detention, the Tamil asylum seeker family welcomed home to Billawila, but their future remains uncertain. The opposition leader under fire for divulging sensitive discussions with the US on acquiring nuclear-powered subs. And as matchmaking apps grow in popularity, what does the future hold for modern love? Joining me on the panel, Australian Paralympic athlete and wheelchair racer Maddie Di Rosario. Great to have you on the show, Maddie.
Thank you.
Non-executive director Ming Long, always good to chat. It's been too long.
It has.
Drag queen, singer and host of ABC's 1+1, which is just wrapped up, Courtney Act. Great to see you, Courtney.
Lovely to see you.
And in Perth, associate editor at The Australian, Jenna Clark. Hello to you, Jenna, all the way over in WA.
Hey, gang.
And you can join us on Twitter using the hashtag The Drum, and we're on Facebook. Opposition leader Peter Dutton has come under fire for apparently divulging sensitive discussions with the United States about the acquisition of nuclear-powered submarines. Last year, Australia agreed to work with the US and the UK to build a fleet of nuclear-powered submarines by the end of the 2030s. However, in a piece published by The Australian on Thursday, Peter Dutton said that if the coalition had stayed in power, he believed it possible to negotiate with the Americans to acquire the first 2 submarines off the production line. This wouldn't mean waiting until 2038 for the first submarine to be built here in Australia. New Defence Minister Richard Marles says Peter Dutton's comments undermine the agreement with the US and UK.
This outburst today from someone so recently in the chair is damaging to Australia's national interest. The comments are loose and undermine the AUKUS agreement.
Well, Peter Dutton appeared on Channel 9 this morning defending his comments.
What I've said is only what's available publicly, and in addition to that, what my thoughts would be on the way forward. And if Labor is going to butcher that and they don't have the money to pay for it, they should be upfront and say it, because that's the path they're taking us down at the moment. And as I say, that is not in our national interest.
Well, defence industry analysts say the government now needs to reassure both the US and UK further sensitive details of the AUKUS partnership won't be made public.
Well, he said a couple of things that are potentially very damaging. He's first of all spoken about the difference between capabilities of nuclear submarines and conventional submarines, and in doing so has basically talked down our current class of Collins submarines. Now, this is very debatable and very disputable, the evidence that he's put forward for that. But that's really disconcerting that he's highlighted some of the capabilities of our submarines and tried to identify that he doesn't basically think they're up to it. There are very sensitive negotiations happening with the United States and the United Kingdom about which submarine we choose, where they are built, how they are built, and airing these types of negotiations in public undermines those sensitive, confidential. This is material that's classified at the highest levels in Australia. This is really important contract negotiations, really important discussions around not just Australian, but US and UK capability and deterrence here. This is not what you talk about in public. If Peter Dutton was really serious about his concerns on this issue, what he should have done was seek a meeting with the Prime Minister and the Defence Minister to talk it through with them. What I don't think you will get is you won't get any clarity on this issue from either the United States, the United Kingdom or the Australian government, because they are sensitive. What I think the government will be trying to do behind the scenes is clean up this mess as much as possible, try and rebuild the trust both with the United Kingdom and the United States, and try to make it very clear that under this new government that basically this megaphone type diplomacy and these types of leaks of sensitive information in the public won't be happening.
Now, Jenna, it seems sensible to start with you here, given that the op-ed was written in your paper. Can you just remind us briefly of the key takeouts of what Peter Dutton was writing about?
Yeah, basically, as a journalist, Kath, it was a delicious piece of an opinion piece that was published, because we love a leaky boat just as much as we love talking about submarines at The Australian. And basically he was saying that, look, if you stuck with us, you stuck with the coalition government, we would have had, we would have been first cab off the rank when it came to getting our brand new submarines. But now that you've got rid of us, we no longer know where we stand. So the Labor government are going to have to pick up those conversations with our AUKUS partners to see where it lands. So it was an eyebrow-raising front page scoop that we published in The Australian, and then in the opinion pages from the former Defence Minister and Home Affairs Minister as well. So it's just been very interesting that again, it seems to be par for the course for the former coalition government, that when it comes to international diplomacy, I think the gentleman there just said it well, it's very much megaphone approach. How our partners, specifically the US, respond to this, it's going to be really interesting over the next couple of days, and albeit in the next couple of months.
Just before we move on to those ideas, just how unusual is it for a leader of the opposition to write something like this? I mean, how did it come about?
Look, yeah, it is interesting, but I think they're just trying to chart their way forward in the brave new world of opposition, of which they've got a brand new leader, they've got a brand new shadow ministry, and I think it's really interesting now that the shadow ministry and the inner circle for Peter Dutton now involves a lot of people that have had very recent experience within the armed forces and armed combat. So I think defence is probably going to be a major cornerstone of their brand new Liberal Party administration. But I think it's really interesting that Peter Dutton has decided to write this piece, and of course course, as journalists, we're always open. We welcome any type of information with open arms, but whether we see this as being sort of how they decide to progress with diplomacy, the crash or crash through approach to opposition, I should say, it's going to be an interesting couple of years, I think.
Indeed. Courtney, before I ask your opinion on this, just important for me to clarify, 1+1 hasn't wrapped up. Your filming has. There's plenty more for us to see,
Exactly.
right?
There are 6 more episodes.
Okay, of deliciousness.
Yes, of delicious.
Like this was a delicious story that we're talking about.
We've had Mark Trevorrow, we've had Baz Luhrmann, we've got plenty more to come.
Okay. Look, so on this issue, Courtney, Richard Marles has called the comments, as we just heard, loose and damaging to Australia's national interest. What do you think Peter Dutton's motivations were here?
I mean, it sounds like Peter Dutton is trying to play political games, which politicians do, but in this instance he seems to be doing it with national security, which, as the Defence Minister, former Defence Minister, it feels like something he should be a little bit smarter about. Raising the issue with the current Defence Minister and the Prime Minister might have been a better way to go about it rather than publishing an opinion piece.
Do you find it surprising?
I don't find it surprising. I had kind of hoped or thought that perhaps the result of the election was a message to the opposition that we kind of have moved on from that style of politics, but it doesn't seem that they have.
OK, well, time will tell on that one, won't it? Maddie, I know that your view on this is perhaps a little bit more about the two-party system that we've got, that it's perhaps a little bit more combative than if we had a proliferation of parties. Can you talk me through your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think when we have two parties that are so, against each other at all times, and that's the entire structure that we have, it does create conflict by design. And so I think, you almost see outbursts and moments like this when things are getting away from somebody, and it's almost, looking at it from where I am, it feels incredibly ego-driven. It's almost, how do we very publicly make a scene that, shows that I'm informed and so necessary, and how do I bring that kind of the focus back to here, and you can see where it comes from. It makes absolute sense. It just doesn't seem, in terms of what it's actually going to achieve for us as Australians, and realistically on the ground for our communities, is there benefit more than him establishing himself as someone who is essential and important, and it does seem incredibly ego.
Ming, you're laughing there. There seem to be two issues at play here. The first is about divulging secrets with our allies, and the second is one that was outlined by the expert that we heard leading in, that raises concerns that the Collins-class subs wouldn't be able to compete with China in the South China Sea beyond 2035. Which is of greater concern?
Oh, jeez. I mean, there's a point where I start with this is interesting, taking Maddie's point, that I just feel like there's an element of relevance deprivation now that he's no longer in government, is now in opposition. I don't like the fact that they're having discussions about things that are above our pay grade. Like, I don't feel like I am qualified to even talk about some of these things, and probably shouldn't be in the public eye. I am very worried about the fact that somebody is putting politics above national interest, that's sort of how it feels to me. But even beyond that, like we always seem to be talking about the big boy toys, right? And one of the things that I was just lamenting in the government in terms of what they put in the last budget, for example, is the limited growth in budget for foreign aid, and the fact that we seem to always gravitate to here's these big machine guns or subs or whatever it is, but the softer power, which is the harder power, which is actually in some respects more influential for our region.
And we know, we've seen that play out just recently,
exactly, in the Pacific, we don't spend any money on and time and attention on. So, he's probably drawing attention to an area that he feels that he has a lot of gravitas in, but as Courtney said, we had an election, we have now moved on, there is a new government in place, and maybe some of these discussions actually need to be behind doors with people who really know what's going on.
Jenna, how do you think... Oh, sorry.
No, I was going to say, it's probably also like a form of fear-mongering, right? It's like submarines, war, like just scaring the population unnecessarily. So we've been through enough. We don't... like you said, these are things that, maybe shouldn't be a part of...
In the front page.
Yeah.
Well, Janet, I mean, how do you think Labor should tread from here? I mean, has this damaged the Australian-US relationship, or is it just a little bit overblown?
Look, I think as we've seen, Prime Minister Albanese, excuse my casualisation there, and Joe Biden seem to have got on famously during the Quad meeting. I thought it was really lovely to see them both speak about, his experiences within the US, and you kind of got a general sense that, I mean, sure, they probably come from the same side of politics, so there's always going to be that type of fraternal sort of love there. But I don't think it's damaged. I think it's probably more reflective on the fact that of the state of the Liberal Party at this point in time. I know we've seen the front page op-ed on The Australian by Peter Dutton, and then just today you've seen in the local paper here in Perth, the Liberal Party are going through the process of reviewing what happened during the election, and they had a strict mandate of saying, right, no mobile phones will be allowed into this meeting, and once again we've seen leaks come out of that because someone filmed and recorded the entire thing. So I think probably they just need to maybe focus on themselves, look inwards, and let the government get on with governing, and then come out and maybe pull them up on some issues that they take umbrance with.
All right, well, it was a big day in Biloela today. This afternoon, the Narasalingam family arrived back there after 4 years in detention and following a tireless grassroots campaign led by the Outback Town's locals to bring them home. It's a huge moment for the family, who were met with smiles, tears and hugs as they were reunited with their community. Mum Priya addressed the media, thanking everyone for their commitment and support.
Hello everyone, thank you so much. Thank you to all in below community, wonderful friends. I starting new life, so happy. Thank you.
Well, tomorrow, Biloela will host a big welcome home party for the family as part of the town's Flourish Multicultural Festival. Ming, clearly a lot of people happy to see them home, not just the family elated as we saw there, but the community. This was a real grassroots event to get them home. How do you feel about it? How do you think the rest of Australia feels about it?
I mean, tearing up because these are human beings that have been, I feel like, used as political pawns to fear-mongering within the community, and especially when we're going through elections. And the fact that they've gone back to their hometown.
That's the point, is it? They're home. It's their home. Their daughters, that's all their daughters knew before they were.
That's right. They were taken away. And I would love for, I think, the Australian community to really understand that the rhetoric that has been run around refugees, they are not criminals. They have every right to seek safety for themselves and for their families. And I would love to think that because of the election we've just had, that maybe there is a shift in the community's understanding that Australian values reconcile with the fact that we should be welcoming of people who are fearing for their life. And maybe it is because that, we don't want human trafficking, people in boats, and we don't want them to die, and that is fine. I can understand that. But also, in the meantime, we can be very generous in ensuring that where there are conflicts around the world, for example, when we had that issue around Afghanistan, that Australia would be even more generous in those circumstances where we can fly them over and give them visas where they can actually start a new life in safety and actually add to the community. You can see from that country town, that is Australian values, not what we've been hearing through the politics of the last 10 years.
Speaking of values, Maddie, I know that you travel a lot internationally representing our country. How do stories like this change the way that people view us as Australia, what values we hold as a nation?
It absolutely has an impact. And I think, I'm so privileged to get to pull on the green and gold and race for Australia, and I'm so proud that I get to represent a place like Australia. And when you see videos like that of that, that homecoming, that's exactly what I feel like is the soul of everything we do. That small town, that's who we are. And I think when we see individuals and families and people's lives used as political pawns, like that's not who we are. That's incredibly privileged people in our communities, you know, utilising, you know, circumstances to kind of make that our identity, and it's not who we are. It's not who we are at all. And
but they were 4 years in limbo, this family, weren't they? And so that showed a different side to Australian policy.
Absolutely, and that's. I don't feel like that's representative of who we are as a people, and that's not, you know, what we want as individuals, you know, on a ground level, on a community level. That's not who we are, and I feel like we're all almost complicit to it, that does become who we are. We can't pretend that's not, because we all exist in this community. And I think, you know, and so often it's very much out of sight. And I think putting faces to stories like this, you know, the humanity that we all see and feel watching that it's unreal.
Jenna, on the policy side of things, we know the former government didn't grant the family protection. The Labor government has granted them a stay, albeit bridging visas at this moment. We know Labor backs offshore processing and boat turnbacks. But where now for Labor policy on borders, on asylum seekers, specifically on those protection obligations?
Yeah, it's going to be a really tricky minefield to sort of navigate, because I think we've seen, I mean, just over the past couple of weeks, we saw once again a boat was turned back only recently, and gentlemen from Sri Lanka who were fleeing because of the economic disaster that's happening in that country at this point in time were taken to Christmas Island in the dead of the night and then flown back to Colombo. So I think they're going to have to move pretty swiftly on how they're going to sort of structure their new immigration policy. But I think at this point in time, a lot of the way that they have to sort of structure it is to really read the room, which I don't think the coalition really did, is like what we're hearing on the panel now. And I think for me, when I hear Operation Sovereign Borders, I really hear that capital O, capital B, and you kind of go, oh wow, it's, you know, you just see that, you know, these SWAT teams are going out into to retrieve bodies from the ocean, and we don't want to see that again. So I think Richard Marles has got a really tough job on his hands, but hopefully if there's a lot of consultation, even with our partners within, you know, our immediate neighbouring partners, that will probably help the fact. And that's what I hope that today's bilateral discussions with New Zealand really does involve a big discussion about immigration policy and how New Zealand and Australia can work together to offer people better lives moving forward.
And just before we leave this topic, Jenna, what does the future hold for the family? Because it's actually not certain at this stage, is it?
No, it's not. So I guess they'll probably settle in with their bridging visa, and then they'll probably start the process of either moving forward with citizenship, or they'll try and maybe grab another type of visa, whether it's a working visa, or they'll go through the refugee status. So it's all up in the air at this point in time. But I think it's beautiful to see that family at home, and I think it just goes to show that's the beauty of having, you know, people that, you know, Australians don't really want to live in regional Australia. So if people want to come to our country and build a life and be constructive members of our society in regional Australia, I think it's a beautiful sight to see.
Okay. Well, it is a long weekend in some states, and so many will have clocked off early today to hit the road, but many may be facing severe delays. Melbourne Airport experienced its busiest day since before the pandemic, with about 97,000 travellers coming and going. Sydney's queues were so long this morning they were snaking outside the terminal, causing some frustration amongst travellers.
We hope to make our flight.
It's pretty chock-a-block, man, you know, but we better move. We've got to keep moving, otherwise we're going to miss the bloody plane.
Pretty bedlam. Yeah, I've got a group trying to get them through here. We're all going together, so hopefully we'll get through in time.
Oh, the queues are fine. The cancelled flights are not very good, though. Meant to be landing in Brisbane at 9:30, and not meant to be landing in Brisbane now till 6:30 tonight, so not very happy about that.
Staff shortages were part of the issue, and the New South Wales Premier says he'll be raising labour shortages more broadly when he meets with the Prime Minister next week.
But on the flip side, isn't it great that everyone's back? Isn't it great that the city is packed, that people are out and about having fun again and going out and going on holidays and enjoying the best that our country has to offer? And so I accept that no one likes waiting in a queue, but better than being locked up at home.
Well, thankfully, as the day progressed, things did improve at the airports. Courtney, chock-a-block, bloody planes. Oh. You know, as we heard from those Vox Pops there, you've taken 4 flights in the last 2 weeks. Do you share that frustration? What was the experience like for you?
I haven't externalised the frustration as much as that, but it certainly was frustrating. Why do we find Australians being Australian amusing? I guess I was watching that. All my flights were delayed. I know there was one I was taking off at midday and I didn't get to Melbourne till 8 p.m. I was going to go this weekend, didn't realise it was a long weekend. The costs were astronomical. Yeah. And then I thought about all of those lines and things and I thought, I'm just going to stay in Sydney. But it is an interesting challenge because I know this is a long weekend, so there's more people, but even in recent times, there's been a lot of congestion and delay and baggage issues at the airports. I don't know why, I'm not a scientist, but it is frustrating.
Well, Maddie, I mean, you came back from overseas just last week and you have an added element to your travel with your wheelchair. Obviously, it's more complex than just than others. So how does this holiday chaos impact on you with that complexity?
Yeah, no, it adds an enormous layer of stress to definitely travelling. You know, I think when we see labour shortages like this and we look at who, you know, it's disproportionate how it impacts travellers, and travelling with a wheelchair is one of the most stressful and dehumanising experiences.
So why is that?
The entire process is, you know, you understand why it's designed the way it is, but once you're on that plane, your wheelchair's taken away from you, and it's something that, you know, is so very much a part of who you are. I can see it over there right now, and I'm stressed by how far away from me it is right now. Like you're
we
so.
could move it closer if you want.
But you're so truly dependent on it, and so, you know, you do have it taken away from you, and if you need to get to your seat, you know, to actually board the plane, there is an aisle chair, and so you're pushed most of the time, and that on its own is an incredibly dehumanising experience. And when we lose incredible staff who, you know, kind of understand that so much more, and it's not the thing that's necessarily prioritised. And so for us at the moment, yeah, travel is always very stressful. We just did get back from overseas and we took a very young team with us, and there were these kids that hadn't travelled, you know, like this before, and you know, the trip kind of starts this like excitement, like we're going to go race in Switzerland, and they'd heard so much about it and it was incredible, and then as the trip goes, like the stress in these 15-year-olds is just kind of building of this, you know, you're so far away from your wheelchair, you have no independence, you're relying on people who, you know, you don't know if you're their priority or not, and it's an incredibly dehumanising, stressful experience. So when we do see shortages like this, the people who it impacts the most, has a huge impact on my community.
I bet. Ming, from a more business lens, I guess, I mean, is this the tangible evidence of a tight labour market, or is it more about us emerging from COVID still? And I guess, should we really be getting it right by now, or is it beyond, you know, the operator's control?
I still feel like a lot of businesses are still trying to find what this new normal is. And so I dare say it's going to exist for some time. There is an element of, you know, they lost, especially in airports, right? We saw the amount of job losses because people just weren't travelling. And so through that process, they would have lost a lot of knowledge about how things hang together and how it should be done, and they'll be trying to sort of madly get that back together. But then you talked about the war on talent at the moment. It's very hard to find people, and especially people you've let go in the past that may not want to work for you again. And so we talk about...
And we hear, sorry to interrupt, but people have left industries altogether throughout COVID.
That's right, because they wanted secure work. Well, you know, it makes complete sense to me. So so there is an element, I heard what, Dominic Perrottet was talking about, but we need now policies in government that enable productivity to happen. So things like universal childcare, we have better childcare workers or availability of childcare so that we can enable people to go back to work, right? Or aged care workers so that we can enable families to be more productive and actually, you know, because we need them desperately in the market at the moment. But then also, like, Manny's just talked about, this just breaks my heart that the processes that sometimes we have within airports, and they're all really important for security reasons, all sorts of reasons why we do certain things. I wonder whether sometimes the lawyers in the policies have taken over the humans in the policies, and we don't even implement them very well anymore. And when it's under so much pressure, then it feels like the humanity in these policies gets sacrificed. And that's such a shame.
The design of all these things, isn't it, and who's inputting it. Just briefly, Jenna, and quickly, I mean, this isn't just an inconvenience for the travellers, as Ming was alluding to there. You know, it's about the design and the process. It's not a great look for the operators of these airports, many of which, I know Sydney Airport is owned by big super and infrastructure funds. Are they going to start demanding better from the operators?
Yeah, they absolutely are, because I think the key word there is business, and the fact that they've got shareholders that they need to perform for as well, not just the travellers and us schmucks stuck back in, you know, economy, having to carry our own bags through or just travelling with hand luggage because you don't know when your baggage is going to arrive. So I think there will be a very big summit held sometime soon about the fact that we are seriously lacking in this country, both skilled and non-skilled workers, and how do we get people back into this country that want to, say, like Ming said, they want to work in childcare, they want to work in aged care. You want to do the jobs and work for contractors that are looking after airports and things like that. So I think that should actually be one of the focal points of the government's workplace summit that is due to take place imminently.
All right, well, in recent years, Australian public life has been marked by growing demands for justice for women and victims of sexual assault. One of the current government's election promises was to implement all 55 recommendations handed down by the Sex Discrimination Commissioner Kate Jenkins in the landmark Respect at Work report published in 2020. Among the most significant recommendations is to impose a positive duty on employers to take reasonable and proportionate measures to eliminate workplace sexual harassment. This would put the onus on employers to prevent sexual harassment. While the requirements would vary by business depending on their size, measures which would satisfy a positive duty include the active promotion of an anti-harassment policy, regular staff training on the topic, and having an accessible complaints process. Ming, can you just in a nutshell encapsulate what positive duty is for employers?
It's hard in a nutshell because we're talking about human behaviours, you know, a culture that exists within society where there is disrespect to women, or there's a lack of respect for women, and then there's also imbalance of power, which means that, you know, some people abuse the power that they do have so that women within the workplace are disrespected. So, you know, the positive duty, I think, that comes to employees will mean that we're actually training our workforce a lot more. There are consequences for poor behaviour, and actually illustrating what good behaviour looks like and what bad behaviour looks like, because I don't think we can necessarily assume that everyone knows what that looks like. There are things like that. There are things like, you know, beyond the sort of training and that we actually give our workers, and I think most of the large employers that I'm attached to actually do that now. The one thing I just want to put on the table, and I will confess I am a non-drinker, that maybe we actually also need to have a look at the alcohol policies we have in the organisations. Because in the past it's like, oh, we have Friday night drinks and someone might get drunk and we laugh and they think, oh, that's so funny. And there's people who drink to excess at Christmas parties and fall over, and we laugh at all that sort of stuff. But we also know that alcohol is a very big enabler of some of this antisocial behaviour, or bullying or harassment or sexual harassment. And, you know, one of the things that I have talked about on some of the boards I've been on is that maybe we actually need to have an alcohol policy within the organisations that we work at that basically say, if you drink to the excess to the point where you no longer can drive home because you no longer potentially are in control of yourself, then maybe that should be prohibited. I might be the Christmas Grinch here and everyone can throw rocks at me.
Yeah, look, it's interesting, those points on training, on consequences, on alcohol. Maddie, you're part of a group which includes Grace Tame that launched Safety, Respect and an Equity campaign. You've been calling for all of these 55 recommendations to be implemented from that Respect at Work report. Labor has committed to that. So where do they start? Is it enough? And what after that?
That's an enormous question.
It is, sorry.
And I don't have an answer for that. But it's something that's going to be, it's so impactful from the minute that it starts. I think that's what's so incredible about this. It's not something that we have to wait until it's, you know, fully instated across the board for it to start having really positive impacts on women in the workforce. And I think that's what's unreal about it. Even opening those channels of communication is going to change everything. One of the the things that we see in these situations is how much silencing happens and how reluctant women are to come forward in these situations, and opening that conversation and having, you know, descriptions of what is, you know, inappropriate behaviour and what isn't, and having that clarity around it. And I think, you know, so many perpetrators thrive in that grey area, and I think, you know, we know that, and we know that's how it goes, and you hear so many stories, and it's almost like, you know, it's open for interpretation, and we allow it to be a conversation as opposed to a very black and white, this is absolutely not okay. And just beginning to implement the 55 means we have that conversation, and it's safe from the minute that we start. So Labor implementing it is incredible.
Courtney, Ming reminded us of those positive duty laws there. I mean, what would that look like in your industry? Could you fathom not going out for drinks after a show or something like that?
Well, Ming's no alcohol policy.
That's up for discussion,
yeah.
right?
I mean, interestingly, the entertainment industry, when working in it, there's a lot of conversation about, I mean, if you're acting, I was in a Sydney Theatre Company play, we talk about what our boundaries are. There's a lot of that conversation, but then also you think about entertainment industry at large and these ideas of like the casting couch, historic places where women have been asked to compromise themselves to get roles, for example. And then
do you think that idea still exists, though, the casting couch?
Look, I hope it doesn't, but I'm sure it probably does in some circumstances, but not, I think before it was not even thought of as being a problem, and that's the problem, is when you're unaware of the problem.
It's the imbalance of power that exists in the casting couch, right? That still exists.
That still exists, but I think that in entertainment there's a lot more policy now, like you're not allowed to be one man alone in a room auditioning women all day long. There's always going to be two people, and simple things like that. And the conversations about what is and what isn't okay. Like, we might think that it's obvious, but obviously it's not, because if it was obvious, then it wouldn't be a problem. And so I think breaking it down, making it simple for people, it shouldn't have to be, I understand, but having these conversations and creating space around them for women in the workplace, for people who might be potential victims in the workplace, is really important, because it means that you feel comfortable talking about it, engaging it and understanding it, and hopefully, you know, these sorts of policies can avoid things from happening in the first place.
You mentioned those grey areas there. Jenna, I mean, we're talking a lot about culture and structures and rules that are in place or yet to be in place in workplaces where there's employees who will work together. But what about when there's like that employee-customer relationship, say in hospitality or in retail? How do you go about protecting your employees that might be harassed by the customer?
Yeah, it's just, there's a lot of work to be done. And I think it just goes to the fact of, like, we have this discussion around, if you take it to the metaphor we use about, like, who's responsible for children's behaviour at school? Is it the teacher, or is it what the kids come to school with their learnt behaviours from home? And I think it just goes to show, when you are out in the community, whether you are either as an employer, an employee, or, you know, utilising a hospitality venue or being a customer, you have to take a lot of onus on how you conduct yourself in public nowadays. And if you are not watching all of this, all of these changes happening in our society and taking note and saying, oh, maybe I do need to reconsider how I conduct myself in certain situations, then I think there has to be a certain amount of personal responsibility that you take. It can't just be, you know, creating safe spaces at work to talk about things. It's what you need to contribute in a very positive way in all aspects of our community, not just in life.
Yeah, Ming, it's that.
Add to that discussion around sort of employee and customer, right? Now, I've been on organisations where we've had employees harassed, right? But it's also then the onus on there as an employer to say to the customer, I'm sorry, I don't want your business if you are going to treat my people that way. And that's
how likely is an employer to do that?
Well, I think this is the point where employers have an obligation to keep our people safe. That's a fundamental rule that all employers have. So, you know, what I would absolutely say is that, you know, in the past, I have seen organisations where the employer has rung the boss of the customer and said, this is what's happened, this is unacceptable, we are drawing the line. Unless you deal with it, then we are drawing the line. And that's actually quite an important message to send to all of your staff that you have, that behaviour is unacceptable. Money does not cover over a multitude of sins.
What about bystander training? Like, what if it's a colleague that oversees something that happens?
Yes, yeah, that's actually quite important as well, because having allies when you're feeling like, I have no power, what am I going to do? Actually ganging up with somebody who is a colleague standing there with you is actually quite important. And you will find that there are conversations that employees will have with them, their bosses in the room, where you have a number of employees actually combine together to raise an issue that also creates safety. But we need to make sure in our organisations that, we have those safe places where people can raise those issues. The problem with some leaders is that, unfortunately, we drag the ball and chain of the title that you have. And so by virtue of the fact that you have a title that says CEO, they're less likely to actually talk to you because you're big and scary. We need to be able to create those, I think, the cultures and the informal relationships within organisations to enable safety and that safety to speak up.
You're certainly not big and scary, and you hold a whole lot of titles, right? So you're breaking the mould right there, Ming. I mean, Jenna, it's easy to say for Labor that they will implement all 55 of these recommendations, but in reality, how hard is it to implement practically?
Yeah, it's going to be a very interesting couple of months. I think it goes to show with the organisation that people like Maddie are working with. I think when we have these discussions out in the community, that's going to teach us how to then go into the workplace and try and implement things like this. But I think, as Ming says, it's good when you are if you have like a new starter coming on board within your team, just maybe encourage them and say, look, find your tribe, find your person that you consider your safety person that if you want to disclose information to, or situations with, you want to flesh out some ideas, just practical things like that. And I think that's maybe rather than starting with the big macro implementation of all of these 55 recommendations, if people just coming into the workplace sort of say, right, how can I help my immediate colleagues or people in my immediate team sort of start at a grassroots level in-house before we get from the CEO to the HR manager down. If we start implementing change at that level, maybe we'll see some positive signs.
Courtney.
I have the unique experience, perhaps, of being perceived feminine sometimes, depending on how I'm dressed, and masculine. And I guess I want to let women know that I know they already know it's real, but I want to let the men know. That's what I want to do. I want to let the men know that all of this talk that women talk about in the workplace and in society is extremely real. I walk around as a male presenting person and I'm treated one way, and when I dress like this, I do get treated a completely different way. I definitely get, different sorts of sexual advances, ogles, looks, comments, and I see it so explicitly because I'm dressed two different ways. So I know we know it's a real thing, but it's happening.
Right.
And it's still happening. And I think this is a system that's been in place for hundreds of years, and it's going to take a while to dismantle it. And these conversations are so important to continue chipping away and furthering that and making sure that, we have a fair and equitable society.
An interesting point, though, and there would be certain cohorts of the society that might say, this is going too far. You can't make jokes anymore. You can't, speak to someone in a certain way. Is there a risk, Courtney, that it's becoming too PC, or is this absolutely necessary?
I think it's absolutely necessary, because if the fear is, oh, I can't say anything anymore, I'd rather you not be able to say anything anymore than somebody get raped. Really. Like, it's just ridiculous. And if you think that you can't say anything anymore, then you just need to be a little bit smarter about what you're saying. If the things you're saying are so reductive that they're offending people, then maybe you need to think a little bit harder.
And you bring up that point that, comedians now might be finding it harder for material, but they just have to think harder and smarter about it. And we could all still be entertained.
Yeah.
And everyone can feel good.
Yeah. I mean, that's the kind of entertainment I want to watch, and that's the kind of thing that, thinking about the direction of comedy, whether it's punching up or punching down, is a conversation, and I think it's an important conversation, and I think comedians can be smarter.
Okay. Well, there's much more to say about this, and it is, of course, a topic we'll continue to follow here on The Drum, so do stay tuned. Well, swiping left, sliding into someone's DMs, or meeting for a quick hookup. Relationships and the way that people look for intimacy are almost unrecognisable from a decade ago. Traditionally, the way of meeting someone might have been at a bar or via an introduction by friends. But according to an ABC Australia Talks survey from 2019, a third of Australians who met their partners did so online. So dating apps have become increasingly prolific. But has that changed what people are looking for from love? Well, in her new book, Heartland, Jennifer Pinkerton interviewed more than 100 people over the last 6 years to investigate what the future of love looks like. And I am pleased to say that Jennifer joins us now. Hi, Jennifer. Thanks for joining us.
Hello. Hello. Thanks for having me.
Now, the idea of this book came from a deeply personal experience. Can you tell us what that was?
Sure. Yeah, the experience was that I'd been working in magazines and travelling, and I went to France and noticed that the culture there was to sort of ask big, deep questions of life. And that's not something that I saw echoed in Australian culture. So while I was living in Alice Springs doing some volunteer work, I had this idea for a book that looked at the role of love in Australian culture. And it just so happened that at the same time, I happened to meet someone in Alice Springs. So it all sort of like coalesced into this love project, which I followed for the next 6 years.
So do you think we love differently today to say 20, 30 years ago? And are we searching for the same thing at the journeys, just different getting there, or have the goalposts moved?
I think the goalposts, sorry, I've almost said Gold Coast, have really moved. Our expectations are way higher than they have been in the past. I don't necessarily think that that's a bad thing, but when you look back, like even just one generation, 2 generations ago, it's like say to the baby boomers, their expectations going into relationships were so much lower than what they are now.
That's interesting, isn't it? I mean, that's one cohort that you're discussing there, you know, the baby boomers, but you spent 6 years, you interviewed more than, 100 people from really diverse backgrounds. There were heterosexuals, gay, bisexuals, polyamorous, religious, different cultural and linguistic backgrounds. Yeah. We know one thing has really changed in the last couple of decades, and that's technology. How do you think that's changed the rules and shifted the landscape on love?
Yeah, great question. I mean, one thing about technology, and if we just look at, say, dating apps for one example, it's so driven by the way that we look. So that sort of elevates visual culture and making judgments based on someone's appearance, which wasn't necessarily something that previous generations experienced.
Wasn't it, though? I mean, wasn't it all about the chemistry? You're at a dinner party in the 50s, or you're at church or at the dance, and you see someone from across the room and there's that thing, that intangible thing there.
That's absolutely true, but that's a face-to-face interaction. Nowadays, many people are connecting like through something that's 2D. So they're looking at a screen and making a judgment on someone based on a very short bio and a couple of curated photos. Remember, people that are choosing their own photos of them looking their best. So it's not the same, I don't think, as running into someone at a dance in the 50s or even at the milk store.
Courtney, you're all over this. You're on Grindr, Tinder. Okay, Cupid.
My realm of expertise.
Okay. You've got the next 15 minutes. Go.
Thank you. I've got my Grindr, my Tinder, my Thrinder, my Field, my Christian Mingle, my J Date. No, I don't have all of those.
See, but you're clearly across it all, right? Yes. So is this just the way it is now, or do you think it's a necessary evil to get you to that person in the flesh?
I think that online dating has its pros and its cons. I do have the apps, but I sort of go between, like, you've got to invest some time in them. It's not just Instagram and such is sort of a bit passive, but with the dating app, you've kind of got to put the groundwork in, and you've got to build these sort of, you're chatting to people and you're looking at this but for me, I think the real life interaction cannot be, exchanged. It can be a way to, save some time, I guess. You can look through a person's interests. My number one tip for dating apps is video chatting. Because you're looking at a two-dimensional photograph. You're reading someone's chosen to say about them also on the photographs. Always judge someone by the photo you're least attracted to
Okay.
Because that's probably going to be closest to what they look like.
Yeah.
Because they've curated these photos. And if you're attracted to that, then that's tick one. And then I think the idea of, and during the pandemic it didn't seem so peculiar, but I always insist on having a video date before a real life date. And you can tell so much about a person from a 30-second, 1 minute, 2 minute conversation.
30-second, that's brutal.
More if it goes well. Well, that's the other good thing. Some of the apps have got them built in and the block button is just very handy.
Right,
it's
there,
like,
right.
oh, yeah.
Oh,
and you just
sorry,
stop
I lost you.
mid-sentence, like you do to the telemarketers. No, I'm kidding. No, that's just the really creepy ones. That's just the really creepy ones.
So, you know, I'd love to know, Jennifer, from the...